Okay, we're going to commence with the second half of the lecture on race, ethnicity, and immigration, chapter 3 in the family by me, Philip Cohen. Thanks for coming. If you're in the class, you know why you're here. If you're not in the class, you've just found this on the internet. Feel free to follow along if you like. We're in somewhere in chapter 3 of the family. We got done discussing the definition of race, definition of ethnicity, racial ethnicity, and how the Census Bureau counts those things, the addition of the new MENA, Middle East North African racial category. And now I want to just say a word about whites. Whites are, a real group. They have a bunch of different ethnicities contained within them. When you look at the ancestries that people record in the open-ended question on the census, when they say they're white, this is what we get. We get German, English, Irish as the most common ancestries listed. So those are sort of the leading white categories, the ethnicities within the white group. And as you can imagine from German, English, Irish, most of these are not recent immigrants, but people whose ancestors came, a few generations ago, at least. White groups do not have the same kind of boundaries around them, especially with regard to families and intermarriage, that some other groups do. So the ethnic identities within whites tend to be relatively weaker. That is, it's not such a big deal if someone with the German great-grandparents marries someone with English great-grandparents. Not nearly as much of a big deal as it is to cross the more recent boundaries, the boundaries of other groups, especially not white groups and more recent immigrants. Okay, so this is where we are in the US population from 1970 up through 2020, sort of 50 years of census data on the categories, the racial and ethnic categories that I described earlier. What you can see is that the white category, that light blue category in the bottom, is losing its dominant numerical status. The fastest growing group is the Latino population, which is now up over 60 million, as you saw in the previous slides. And the white population has actually peaked and has declined a little between 2010 and 2020. That is the non-Hispanic white population who are not any other race also. So this has all kinds of sort of social and political implications, but it's largely symbolic. If you break this down by for one particular day, as I did for the year 2023, you can see that the natural increase or decrease among whites is negative. That is, every day about 6,300 whites die and about 4,900 whites are born. So there's about 1,400 fewer whites every day. That's not counting immigration. That's what we call natural decrease. And among non-whites, everybody else, there's about 4,200 new ones born and 42 new ones who die and 4,900 who are born. And so there's an increase of about 750 each day. So between those two, we gain about 2,000 non-whites per day increase in the population. All right, if that makes any sense. Our immigration is a big part of the story here. It's not natural increase or the difference in birth rates and death rates is not really what's driving our ethnic composition. In the US, it is mostly immigration. This chart goes back to 1900. It shows, if you look back at 1910, that was the previous peak in the number of immigrants, the percentage of immigrants, when almost 15% of people in the US had been born somewhere else. They were overwhelmingly from Europe and Canada. Over the course of the 20th century, those same people were still alive, were gradually dying out. And then after 1965, and we'll talk about that date in particular, we started seeing a new influx of immigrants, largely from Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Asia. And that has really changed the composition of our immigrant population and also increased the number of immigrants. So now we're up to over 14% of the total population, again, being foreign born, almost as much as it was back in 1910. This also has important implications. All right. 3.2, I'm now going to talk about a number of specific groups and just give you some of their contours. We'll come back to immigration after I do this. Number one, chronologically, American Indians. Before the arrival of Europeans on the continent, there were something like several million American Indians. Of course, they weren't called that then. There were many different nations or tribes or peoples that were living here. By the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, that is 1900, that population had been reduced by probably about 2/3 is our estimate from disease and war, the genocide of conquest. That rapid growth over the last century is due largely to the greater desire of those with mixed ancestry to express that identity. That is, we have a lot of people who have some Indian and some non-Indian heritage, and a lot more of them are now coming forward, especially on the census, and saying, yes, I have Indian ancestry. And so the numbers have increased. There's also some data problems, which we might get a chance to talk about later. By 2010, about 1 out of 5 American Indians lived on reservations, which are mostly rural areas with relatively desperate social and economic conditions, located far from the centers of economic opportunity, very marginalized rural populations with a lot of health problems, especially on the reservations, poverty, social isolation, problems associated with that, like diabetes and alcoholism, obesity, and family violence. So very, very troubled and difficult existence for many people on Indian reservations, a continuation of that conquest by the Europeans. When we looked at when we experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the rate of mortality from COVID-19 was much higher among American Indians than among other groups. And in particular, when you look at the number of children who lost a caregiver, that is somebody who was taking care of them, as the chart here shows, much higher rates, much more likely that that was going to happen. About 600 out of every 100,000 American Indian children lost a caregiver to the pandemic. Switch to African Americans. Also an experience of chronic inequality going back to the origins of their arrival on the continent and slavery, the discrimination, poverty, and unemployment that followed, leading to high mortality and deep residential segregation, people living apart. The picture here is of W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived from 1868 to 1963, the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard, who was a sociologist who studied the Black community. In particular, he wrote a very influential book about Philadelphia, in which he focused, for our purposes, highly relevant, on marriage rates, the low rates of marriage in the Black community in Philadelphia, more single mothers, cohabiting couples. And he tried to understand how this was happening. He saw this definitely as problematic. And his conclusion was it was the legacy of the oppression of slavery and then the discrimination that they experienced later in urban ghettos that had devastating consequences for Black family life. That was his conclusion from looking at the situation around 1900 in Philadelphia. That the history of Black family structure and its relationship to poverty and oppression has figured very prominently in subsequent histories and analysis. There is a particular story that attaches Black family composition to the legacy of slavery, and particularly the tendency of enslaved people and their descendants to have more informal or common law marriages, higher divorce rates, more extended family members, so less stable, long-term nuclear-only families. An analyst like this man, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, produced reports that essentially reinforced racist stereotypes about these problems by attributing racial inequality to family structure rather than the other way around, rather than saying the family structure resulted from inequality, as W.E.B. Du Bois had said. He tended to look at it the other way and say, well, yes, we have that history, but now in 1965, 2/3 of a century later, it is the less traditional and nuclear family life in Black communities that is causing their problems. An opposing perspective, what you might call the family resilience perspective, is more in the tradition of Du Bois, which I described, and it sees the response to economic hardship as a form of resilience. So that more adaptive, fluid family structure has been a useful reaction to persistent oppression in Black communities, not a cause of of poverty and attendant problems. And it is historical research shows Black nuclear families and separate spheres in general, nuclear and separate spheres families, were limited by poverty, lack of mobility, and mortality. The same thing that had made separate spheres a distant ideal for whites in much of the 19th century continued for Black families in the 20th century. Okay, so this is more the resilience perspective that sees these so-called non-traditional family structures as a creative, fluid adaptation to hardship. I want to focus a little bit on segregation just to be clear, so we can see exactly how extreme this is. This is Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 2021. I made 3 maps. These are the same area. One map shows the white population, one the Hispanic population, and one the Black population. And the gist of it, what I want you to see is just how separately these communities live. The old industrial cities of the North and Midwest in particular are the most segregated today. There was a large migration of Black families from the South. We call the Great Migration around 1910 through about 1970. Black workers leaving agriculture, bringing their families from the South to new blue-collar work opportunities in the factories of the North, the industrial cities of the North, which provided good job opportunities, but much segregation. They moved into ghettos, essentially, and that's where we got the ghettos in American cities. It was around this time. These cities remain highly segregated today. And one consequence of that is that when America started deindustrializing and our economy became less industrial and less linked to manufacturing, less organized around manufacturing and factories, shifting from the production of goods to the production of services, from producing cars and refrigerators to software and banks. A lot of the blue-collar workers in the cities ended up with no job or had to transition into much more poorly paid service jobs. So, the classic example is leaving a factory and getting a job at McDonald's, and you end up with a much lower paid job without the kind of security and promotion ladder that jobs used to have. So the fact that they had moved historically into these cities, good opportunity at the time, boomeranged and became a bad situation when they were stuck in deindustrialized cities. Okay. One thing that we get, and I'll do one of these figures for each group as we go, in the family profile is much lower marriage rates among the Black population than the white population. The bar graph on your left shows the Black population compared to the US total. You see somewhat lower rates of college completion, much higher rates of children being born to mothers who are not married at the time of the birth. About 70% of Black children have a mother who's not married at the time they get married, compared to 40% of the population overall. And then higher poverty rates, as you would expect. The graph on the right that shows the trend since 1950, I partly do to show the large difference in the percentage of adults who are married between Black and white. So 34% of Black and 51% of white adults are married as of 2021. But if you'll notice, if you go back to 1950, these rates were much more similar in 1950. So this is not a direct consequence of slavery in the sense that we always had this big gap in marriage rates. The gap in marriage rates has, in fact, opened up, and the deindustrialization story that I told on the last slide is a big part of that. The worsening economic conditions, the concentration in poverty and living in high poverty areas has contributed to lower marriage rates, and I'll talk more about that next. Why are there so many single Black women is the story behind the numbers for this chapter. I'm sorry, the text got a little cut off right there. But the gist of it is there's a set of larger social forces in the economy and job discrimination, incarceration, and health issues that produce essentially a shortage of Black men relative to the Black women who might want to get married. So here you see 4 cities: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. In each case, there are fewer single men than single women. And the reasons for this are in the other parts of the chart: higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of mortality, and higher rates of unemployment. Okay. Just to be clear, those charts with little pictures of the people. It's the number of employed unmarried Black men for every 100 unmarried Black women. So the idea is Black women are thinking about who to marry, as are white women. They're thinking about marrying a man with a job. It's kind of a traditional, slightly sexist assumption, but not crazy. And so the combination of health problems, incarceration, poverty, and unemployment is what creates that relative shortage of men. Okay. So it's one part of the story of the lower marriage rates among Blacks than whites. Switch to Latinos, the largest minority group in the country at present. A very large, very diverse population. Some of them have been in the country for many generations. Some were in the country before the country was the country, and the country, came to them. But some are more recent immigrants. They or their parents or grandparents came to the U.S. as immigrants. The largest groups are Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Central American. Puerto Rican people are U.S. citizens, but are still considered immigrants from Latin America. It's just a colony that America happens to have in Latin America. There's a tremendous diversity among the Latino population. We have seen in the last decade or so a growing migration of desperate refugees coming from Latin America, driven by economic crisis, violence, political violence, natural disasters of various kinds, so that we have had a large influx of desperate refugees, many of them seeking asylum in our immigration system. That continued flow of immigration in general helps maintain the cultural continuity. If you drop a population of people from one place to another and don't have a flow of new migrants, then you can imagine their culture kind of dissipating over time. If you have a steady stream of new people arriving, bringing with them their cultural ways, then you end up with more cultural continuity among the immigrant population. So that's one thing that we see with the relatively constant influx of new Latinos. One aspect of that cultural continuity is what is sometimes called familism, that outlook that puts family obligations first or high up in people's priorities, involves self-sacrifice for family well-being, includes intergenerational ties, grandparents taking care of grandchildren, and all that, and living in extended families with cousins and aunts and uncles, and so on, partly as part of that migration experience. Okay, a little bit about the current Latino experience. When you look at the profile, I chose 3 groups here: Mexican, Central American, and Puerto Rican. You can see they all have lower college graduation rates than the US population, similar percentage of births to unmarried women, a large number of foreign-born people, especially among Central Americans, where the majority are themselves immigrants, that is not born here, and relatively higher poverty rates, especially among Puerto Ricans, compared to the general US population. Okay, switching to Asian Americans, I say a little bit about their particular circumstances. One issue, education. We see Asian Americans have high educational attainment, very low high school dropout rates on average. More than 3/4 of them are high school graduates or more in the ages 18 to 29. So that's higher than the rest of the population. More Asian Americans go to college and get professional degrees for a variety of reasons. One, you'll hear this a lot. It has to do with the Confucian background, the tradition of striving for educational excellence, the strong parental support for education, and so on. On the other hand, that can be overplayed in the analysis, and it's also the case that many Asian Americans have come from immigrant families who had higher education or came here to continue their professional careers that they already had started. So they already had advantages when they came, in many cases, obviously not all cases. One thing about our immigration law is it has privileged for legal arrival people with relatively high skills. So if you're coming to study here, or you're coming to get a job because you already have high skills. So we have a flow of new Asian people into the population that have relatively higher education levels. So to look at the three largest groups, Chinese, Filipino, and Asian Indian populations, you see they all have higher college graduation rates than the US population, especially those from India. Many of those already had college degrees when they arrived. They have low rates of births to unmarried women, again, relatively privileged before they arrived, very high numbers foreign born, and relatively low poverty rates, except Chinese Americans who have a population that has been here much longer than some other groups. One thing about the Asian American experience I want to focus on a little bit in particular is the recent racism. We've had racism, of course, for a long time. However, this has gotten worse in recent times. The picture of Trump is not an accident. Most Asian groups do have higher levels of education and lower poverty rates, as you just saw, but it is not entirely true. There are some especially from Southeast Asia, who do have higher poverty rates and work in blue-collar jobs. So we don't want to overgeneralize. There is a long tradition of exclusion of Asian immigrants. Goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, when Americans have seen the Asian population as competition that they feared. On the other hand, there's the other side of that double-edged sword is the model minority stereotype, the idea that Asian Americans are sort of inherently or automatically successful, good students, and so on, which is a form of stereotyping which seems positive, but also comes back to be not so positive if you don't, for people who don't achieve that standard, and also for people who just want to be treated as individuals. And then in the most recent period, a very strong rise in anti-Asian racism associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, which was fueled by Trump himself, who called it the Chinese flu and so on, and blamed China in particular, and a lot of anti-Asian violence and hate that came out of that experience. Okay, a little bit about different groups. I'm going to talk about immigration itself, the history, the policy, and some things about our immigrant people. Okay. We have had since forever a lot of immigrants in this country. Okay, that's what you'll hear. The country was founded by immigrants. At the moment, it's about almost 15% of the population are immigrants that is born somewhere else. You saw that in the previous figure. If you include Americans whose parents were born somewhere else, it's about a quarter of the population who could be said to belong to an immigrant family. Immigration has accelerated in the last few decades, and one consequence of that has been immigrants living in many parts of the country that were not previously host to a lot of immigrants. So we've had a lot of people meeting immigrants in large numbers for the first time in the last few decades. Okay. As you saw from the previous figure, there's a wave of immigration that dates to about 1965. That was a change in the federal law that allowed so-called family reunification migration. That is, that allowed people to bring their spouses and children and parents if they were already here. If they were already here as citizens, they could bring family members, and also ended a quota system that had been used to keep out immigrants from countries in Latin America and Asia. So once that law changed, we saw a big flow of immigration from Latin America and Asia. This has allowed immigrant communities to thrive and be rejuvenated by the influx of recent arrivals. But that has the possible consequence of increasing social distance. You have more people arriving who don't speak English. You have more communities building up around the influx of new groups instead of more dispersed, more integrated groups integrating into the rest of the society. So a little bit of two things happening at once. Going to take a little bit of a pause to talk about, there's a box in the book called The Changing Law, Immigration, Uniting and Dividing Families. This is highly relevant right now because of the attempt by the Trump administration to overturn what we call birthright citizenship. This has been part of a seesaw of permissions and penalties, of crackdowns and welcoming to different degrees in American history. The first really restricted immigration law was a racial law called the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically oriented toward keeping out Chinese immigrants who were not keeping new immigrants from coming and keeping the those who were here from becoming citizens. It was driven by largely white workers who were afraid of Chinese workers taking their jobs, having to do with the development of California and the West. One case that came out of this era that turns out to be very important to this day is the 1898 case of the immigrant the U.S. citizen born in the U.S. named Wong Kim Ark. He was born in San Francisco. His parents were Chinese immigrants. And when he traveled back to China and then tried to come back, he was stopped at the border, at the port, and told he could not, that he was not a citizen because his parents were Chinese. Now, under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was ratified after the end of slavery, anybody born here is an American citizen, as long as they are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States at the time that they are born, which is basically everybody who's born here, unless your parents are diplomats or you're part of an invading army. That's what Trump is going to say when his case comes to the Supreme Court about ending birthright citizenship now. He's going to say that today's undocumented immigrants are part of an invading army so that their children should not be considered U.S. citizens when they're born. This is a very long tradition, a hard-fought case won by Wong Kim Ark in 1898. Additional restrictions on immigration in 1924, another round of restrictive laws. On the other hand, at some other periods, the U.S. has done more to bring workers in the so-called Bracero program. They gave temporary work permits to millions of Mexican workers. A lot of people came into the country at that time and put down some roots here, although many were also deported. Then that series of changes to the law I described in 1965 allowed people to come from countries that had been previously restricted. When we look at the more current period, we've had the period of border policing and border control. One ironic consequence of more strict policing of the border is more migrants decide to stay here. When it's easier to cross the border, people kind of come and go for jobs and work and so on. When you make the border hard to cross, people are afraid to go back, so they end up staying. One particular policy under the Barack Obama administration called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It gave temporary protection to people who had come to the U.S. Undocumented without authorization, but as children. Under this law, they have been allowed to be free from the fear of deportation and been allowed to go to school and work and so on. This is not is a policy of the administration, but is not written into law by Congress, and so it is vulnerable to being taken away. Trump says he plans to kill this, and so the DACA, the so-called Dreamers, their fate is not clear at this point. The most recent period, the Build the Wall period, after Trump's first election, involved trying to restrict entry by replacing fencing and building new fencing along the border. And then in the Biden administration, after 2021, after Trump was out of office the first time, that asylum crisis I mentioned earlier. Record numbers of arrests, many people, millions of people crossing the border, desperately seeking asylum. Many of them are still here and are now facing the possibility of mass deportation. Okay, talk a little bit about the processes of acculturation and assimilation. What happens when immigrants get here and what happens to their communities? We call it acculturation when immigrants and their children learn the ways of their new homeland through interaction with the host culture, the acquisition of a new culture and language. You come here, you learn the ways of the local people, we call that acculturation. That is different from assimilation. When new groups blend into society through assimilation, we're really talking about the reduction of ethnic distinction between immigrants and the mainstream or host society. Not just the immigrants changing, but the two populations moving towards each other. Assimilation can only work when the host society is welcoming and accepting of the new group. So acculturation is just something the immigrants can do themselves to learn the culture and language. Assimilation is the communities coming together, the host and the new arrivals, the host society and the new arrivals merging together. So if you eat Mexican food now and you are not of Mexican ancestry, that's part of assimilation. It's not just Mexican immigrants and their descendants changing, it's the mainstream society changing as well. Okay. In the book, I tell the story of my own grandmother. There she is in front of the bar and liquor store that my grandparents operated. That other picture is them when they were children, my grandmother and her siblings and their mother, close to when they migrated from Poland to the US. We use these generation terms to describe the immigration experience, sort of working our way from older to younger. We call people the 0.5 generation, sort of the half generation, when they arrive at retirement age. So they didn't grow up here, they grew up somewhere else, and now they're joining their families in the US at an older age. They often do not have a good command of English. They don't have a history of employment in the US. They may be glad to be here with their families, but also miss their homelands, even as they are providing a sense of connection to their children and grandchildren. The first generation are the classic immigrants, people who are working age adults when they migrate. They come here to work. It is usually their decision that brings the family to the United States. That's the mother of my grandmother you see in that picture. They may be successful at work if they came here because there were opportunities. They take those opportunities, and yet they never feel fully integrated, often because they grew up somewhere else. So their English is not as good, and they often feel like outsiders. Their children, the 1.5 generation, are those who came when they were not quite newborns. So in the sort of 6 to 12 range, they learn to speak a different language first. They may speak English imperfectly, but they pick it up, and they are often the most acculturated members of their family. If you're 40 or 35 and you come here with your 6 or 10-year-old child, that child's going to learn English faster than you do and is going to end up being more American than you. This produces some generational conflict, but also opportunities for those children. Then when immigrants come and have children here who are born here, we call them second generation. They're born and raised here. They are members of an immigrant family, but they are not themselves immigrants. They're the transitional generation. They have a more easy acculturation, being learning the language from birth. And then finally, the third generation, when the immigration experience starts to fade into the past, the grandchildren of immigrants, like that's me, we may retain our identity as part of an immigrant family, but we come to see that ethnicity as sort of family history rather than their experience. I don't have an immigration experience. I had grandparents who had a Yiddish accent. Okay. Going to talk a little bit about intermarriage. One of the reasons that we focus on intermarriage in family sociology class is that this is one of the ways that we can see, that we can measure and study the process of integration or assimilation between different populations. You could say intermarriage is a litmus test of racial and ethnic difference. If people don't marry each other, then they are really more separate. If they do marry each other, then they start to grow closer together. We call it intermarriage when members of a different racial or ethnic group marry each other. So simply that, marriage across a group, or you could call it exogamy, as we discussed the other day in class. This has been controversial. This has been conflictual. Most African Americans through the middle of the 1900s lived in places where intermarriage was illegal. It was not legalized. That is, it did not become illegal to ban intermarriage until 1967 in Loving v. Virginia, when the Supreme Court told the state of Virginia they could not have a law against intermarriage, that was unconstitutionally restricting the choice of people in Virginia of who they wanted to marry. You can see two different perspectives on intermarriage rates in this graph. This shows through 2017 anyway. Let's It's more recent in the book. I'm sorry about that. This shows that through 2017, 8% of Black marriages involved Black people marrying white people. So that's 8%. Is that a lot? I don't know. But a percentage of whites marrying Blacks is less than 1%. That's because the white population is bigger. So the same number of marriages is 8% of Black marriages and less than 1% of white marriages. So you can see the direction is towards rising intermarriage, but the numbers are still quite low, especially from the white perspective. Like I said, we can consider intermarriage sort of a litmus test of relations between groups. You can also ask people what they think about it. This is the percentage of whites who are either opposed or very opposed, somewhat opposed or very opposed to a close relative marrying a Black person. I've split white people by age here. So you can see back in 1990, most white people, over age 35 would be somewhat or very opposed, almost 70%. Younger people, less so. Half of young white adults in 1900 would have been somewhat or very opposed according to themselves on a survey. Now those numbers have come down quite a bit. It's a little bit less than 1 out of 5 whites over age 35 and less than 1 out of 10 whites under age 35. So we could call this a decline of social distance, a decline in the opposition to intermarriage, social distance, the level of acceptance that members of one group have towards another. So the less acceptance, the more social distance. So this graph shows declining social distance, as does the rise of intermarriage. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week.